Hello, everyone. How's it going? We are going to get started with the next in the latest and greatest list of amazing speakers that we have here at LangFest. This morning, we are fortunate, blessed to hear from Olly Richards. Olly Richards is a big friend of LangFest. He is one of our key advisors, which means that when Joey and Tetsu were trying to figure out how to make this whole event happen properly, how to get good messages across, how to communicate things, they looked to Olly, and of course Steve Kaufman as well. Olly is the founder of I Will Teach You a Language. I understand Olly speaks 8 languages, and he is also not only a teacher, he is a storyteller. If you go on Amazon, he has a number of books that you can tell short stories in a number of different languages that he has prepared. He is prolific on YouTube. He is also has more than 200 podcast episodes for his I Will Teach You a Language podcast. I am going to let him do the show here, not my intro words. Everyone, big warm welcome for Olly Richards.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. For those of you who are arriving, please do feel free to come down to the front. You don't have to hang around at the back. So yeah, this talk is going to be all about memory. And I don't think I know much about memory, really. It's always been an ongoing struggle for me, but it's because of that struggle that I always have with memory that this talk is happening today. Because I'm going to basically try and tell the story of my thinking and activities over the last year or so to try and understand my own memory and the memories of the people that I work with, and then hopefully as a result of all of this, it will add some, give you guys just some food for thought, really, and the better that you can understand some of the issues and considerations around memory, the better, I think. I'm trying out a new approach today. Every time I give a talk, I try a different way of doing it. I was telling Mark earlier, sometimes I have the slides up and I base what I say off the slides. I did something in the Czech Republic earlier this year where I had my notes on index cards, which turned out to be a disaster. I had to hold a mic in one hand, the clicker in the other hand, and then somehow figure out how to read all my index cards. So I'm trying something a bit different this year. I've got my notes on the screen, which is separate from the presentation. So we'll see how it goes. Bear with me in case everything falls flat. I really enjoy coming to these conferences, and I try to go to at least one or maybe 2 every year. And it's great because you come here and everyone wants to hear from you. But I do feel a certain amount of pressure because I feel it's a little bit like, you know TED, you know the TED event where you get like these great speakers coming together and giving these talks. I kind of feel like there's a certain amount of pressure for every talk to be somehow life-changing, and you know, you kind of have to deliver this wisdom from on high. And so I always feel a certain amount of trepidation about that. But I'm trying to go the other way with this one today. And I'm like I say, going to try and talk you through some ideas and lead you to draw conclusions. So we're talking about memory, and I'm very aware that I'm talking to a room full of extremely prolific and talented language learners, so I don't think I'm going to tell you anything that you don't know. Again, the aim is going to be just to give you the food for thought. What I've learned from meeting a lot of very experienced language learners and people that in the community that I'm lucky enough to be able to call friends now, is that the thing with experienced language learners is that if you want to learn a new language, add a new language to your catalogue, all you really need is time, right? You pretty much know what to do, and you know how language learning works for you. All you really need to put it into action and to learn another language is more time. So I'm always kind of wary of trying to give prescriptive advice, because it's always something that you have to take with a pinch of salt and apply to your own situation. But very much like Mark said in his talk, I think that there's a temptation to forget what it's like to be that beginner language learner. You know, that in that situation where you just set out for the first time learning a new language, and it's easy for us to forget what that feels like, and it feels like a big black hole. What do you do? How do you learn? So the way that I see what I do with my blog and my podcast and various other things is I'm very much talking to the person in that position, setting out for the first time, trying to figure out how to go about learning. And so when I sort of decide what I want to talk about, the advice that I want to give, I always tend to go to verge towards the specific and give specific tips and specific advice, rather than the kind of, well, find your own way advice. Because I always feel that we learn languages by actually doing. You know, we try different methods, we try things out. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. But either way, we learn from experience of our own success or failures, right? So I always tend to gravitate towards trying to give specific tips. And then if it works for you, great. If it doesn't, well, that's also great, because you learn something in the process. So when it comes to memory, in particular, how many of you guys feel like you understand your memory and how it works? Okay, that's quite a few hands, guys. You know, 10% of the room at least feels like they understand their memory. How many of you guys have no idea? All right, 20% of the room. And then I guess for everyone else, it's somewhere in between. I guess you've kind of figured out certain techniques that tend to work over time, right? So for beginners, when they're first setting out learning a language, what often happens is the language learning equivalent of this.
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again."
Anyone seen that before? Do you want to watch it again? Let's watch it again.
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again."
Right, so can you relate? Have you ever been in that situation when you're speaking a language where that thing happens to you? It might just be with one word or with one phrase, but it's just like you're in the flow, you're in the middle of it, and things just don't work, right? We're going to come back to this later. So, why are we talking about memory, and why have I been thinking about memory recently? Well, for most language learners, when they're first starting out, you're at the A0, A1, A2 level. Your main challenge to get up to the point where you can actually speak a language is to grow your vocabulary, right? Grammar, yeah. Pronunciation, yeah. All important, but really, looking to get to that point where you can actually speak a language, the only thing that really matters is the vocabulary, because unless you know the words, you can't do anything else, right? And so, for most beginner language learners, growing vocabulary is the big challenge, the big focus for the first few months of the process, at least. And as experienced language learners, we all know that vocabulary is learned in many different ways, right? There's no one way to learn vocabulary. But here's the thing, for the beginning language learner, the perceived difficulty is a memory difficulty. The way that beginning language learners articulate their struggles growing their vocabulary at the beginning is, my memory is rubbish. Or, there's something wrong with my memory. I just don't have a memory for words. I'm sure you've probably caught yourself saying something like this at some point. This is the perceived problem. And so for that reason, I think it's valid to talk about memory and memorization as a concept, because I'm aware that a lot of experienced language learners tend to rebel against this concept of memory and memorization, but I think it's valid for that reason, because it's the perceived difficulty. And I believe that your vocabulary growth and your memory can be positively influenced by memory techniques. So in terms of my own language learning, it's been a really weird experience, because I've had to reinvent my relationship with memory over the years. I first started learning languages with Romance languages, so my first language was French. After that, I learned Italian, and then Spanish and Portuguese. And as I look back on it, I don't remember using any memory techniques whatsoever. no flashcards, maybe the odd mnemonic or image association or something there. Probably had the odd word list, but I didn't use any specific memory techniques when I was learning Romance languages. I just kind of set out this process of speaking a lot with people, a lot of language exchanges, a lot of TV, a lot of traveling, and it just kind of happened over time. And of course, with Romance languages, the more that you know, the easier it gets, right? So when I came to learn Portuguese, my fourth Romance language, I really could just describe it as being fairly straightforward because it was just, you know so much already. So the other thing with Romance languages, of course, is that the more advanced you get, the easier it gets because all of the vocabulary tends to have shared roots, shared Latin roots and things like that. So as you're trying to, when you start to talk about more advanced topics in Spanish or French, you can pretty much guess the word, and half the time it's going to be very similar to the English. So I had a fairly straightforward time with my Romance languages. And then I started learning Asian languages, and everything changed. So after my experience with Romance languages, I went on to learn Japanese, Cantonese, Arabic, and Thai, all to very, very, very different levels. My Thai is rubbish, but I've had the experience of actually trying to learn it. And the thing that I found with Asian languages is that it starts hard and it gets harder. It's the opposite of Romance languages, where the learning curve is kind of pretty much like this, I think. But with Asian languages, it starts hard and it gets harder because with every new thing that you learn, every new vocabulary word you know, you have to learn it from scratch. You've got no Latin or Germanic roots to fall back on. It gets harder and harder and harder. For me, I can only talk about my experience. So for me, having spent the last 4 or 5 years learning Asian languages, I can only characterize my experience of learning Asian languages really as one never-ending vocabulary nightmare. Grammar with Asian languages, pretty straightforward. Cantonese, Thai, it's there's not much there. Pronunciation can be tough. I think I have got a musical background, so I haven't had any particular problems with pronunciation. It's just vocabulary all the way. And so this is what sparked my general interest with vocabulary. It's this difficult experience I've had with Asian languages. And here's the thing, the basic point for me is that when I'm trying to grow my vocabulary in Asian languages, stuff doesn't stick. It just doesn't. I could try and explain it in more nuanced terms, but basically it doesn't stick. And this is something that we can all relate to, right? Now, other people have different experiences. I was chatting with Steve Kaufman recently, and he told me, when I learned Chinese, I don't remember having done any deliberate memorization or any deliberate learning at all. For him, it just happened naturally. It's amazing. For me, the opposite is true. I have to work for every single little bit of information and progress that I get. So others, I'm very aware, will say things like, I just learn from context. I just read and I speak and I just learn that way. I find that incredibly frustrating to hear because it just doesn't work for me. So what the typical thing that will happen for me in Cantonese, which is the language I've been focusing on for a while, is that I'll be chatting with a friend and I'll hear a new word and I'm like, what's that word? And she'll tell me the word and I'll say, okay, that's a cool word, I'll remember that. I think, great, got a new word. Literally 15 seconds later, it's gone. Literally, I'm not exaggerating, I'm not doing this for effect. It literally disappears. And then I'll say, oh man, I've just forgotten that word. What was it again? And I'll hear it again, and I'll say, okay, I've got it now. And then 15 seconds later, it's gone. This happens I don't know why it happens, but it does happen endlessly. And so I don't know why that is. Maybe my level isn't good enough yet. Maybe I don't pay enough attention to the vocabulary. Maybe I don't spend enough time doing it. All of these things are possible. I don't know. But given that I've had this problem and this difficulty, my way of approaching this is, right, I have to believe there is a way to influence this process and get better at this thing. So what I've been doing is trying to work on a framework for what we'll call memory or memorization that guides me in my effort to deliberately and methodically grow my vocabulary. So I've been working on that, and I've been teaching it to other people through my website and courses, and I have tried to keep it really, really simple, because for me, for something to work, it has to be simple. And what I find is now that whenever I come back to this framework, or rather, whenever I find that my progress is stagnating, or I'm having trouble, or I just kind of look back on the last few weeks of learning and realize I haven't really learned that much in the last few weeks, I come back to this framework, and it helps me identify the bit that where I've been going wrong. And what I've called this is the A.R.T technique. Not really a technique, but the A.R.T framework doesn't sound so good, so I'll call it the A.R.T technique. And works quite nicely because it plays into the art of memory, etc., etc. It's all a bit fancy, but the main point is that it's easy to remember. I want this to be easy to remember and practical for that reason. And my contention, and you can judge me on this at the end, is that whatever your language learning method, however you go about learning languages, any method for growing your vocabulary will actually follow this technique one way or another. I've spent a lot of time talking to successful language learners about how they grow their vocabulary, and I believe that everything that they do, every plausible, effective technique follows this framework. So we can chat about that later. So let's go back to Bush. I want you to tell me, why did that happen? That thing that happened to him where he was, it's just, it's bad. He's in front of the world's media, he's on camera, it doesn't get much worse than that. He starts to say something and he realizes it doesn't come out. Why did it happen? I want you to tell me why that happened. Paul.
I'm guessing that this is like an idiom that he heard a long time ago in his childhood, and he kind of felt it, but he hadn't used it in many years maybe, and it didn't come out.
Right, so the reply was, in case you couldn't hear, this is probably an idiom or an expression he heard in childhood. He's kind of vaguely aware of what it is, but then now he's suddenly at the point where he wants to replicate it and produce it himself, and he realizes it's just not there, right? For me, that is exactly what happens to us in language learning. Don't you think? We spend all this time talking and listening and studying. We've got a lot of stuff in our kind of, vaguely in our memory somewhere, but when it comes time to speak, it's difficult to just access that and get it out in speaking. So he's heard this expression, and for those of you who aren't sure, the complete expression is, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. That's what he tried to get out. And he's heard it a few times before. He's never really paid much attention to it, but it's quite a catchy little thing, and so he wants to use it. And so this expression has lived in his head, in his general awareness, but it's nothing more than that. So when it comes time for him to access that expression, even though it's in his native language, so you can know it's obvious how much more difficult this is in a foreign language. Even though it's in his native language, when it comes time for him to access that in his memory and produce it in his own speech, it's highly unreliable because, well, we'll come on to why that is in a moment. It's made worse also by the fact that this particular expression is not immediately obvious and logical, isn't it? Shame on, fool me once, shame on you. Even now when I say it, I have to check myself to make sure I'm getting it right? So most of our new vocabulary in a foreign language is a bit like this. We've kind of got some awareness of it. You probably call it passive vocabulary, maybe. But when we fall short is when we need to produce it. So if I was coaching Bush, if he was here and I was telling him how to make sure this never happens again, what would I say? I'd say, Bush, you need to take this phrase that you want to memorize and use, and you need to take it through a deliberate process of attention. You need to take this phrase, and you need to take it through a deliberate process of attention in your mind, so that your brain has some kind of cognitive safety net, a second layer of hooks, an insurance policy against forgetting it in the moment, so that when it comes time to speak, you've got something else to rely on other than your fuzzy memory of what that expression is. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah? It's very similar to muscle memory for musicians. How many musicians do we have here. Quite a lot of music. You're aware of muscle memory? It's the idea of when you're playing a piece on the piano, you're learning a piece, you can kind of, after you've been practicing it enough times, you kind of know it and you can play it. But a lot of that is just your fingers remembering what note to play next. You don't actually have a mental understanding of what that all is. And the reason that's dangerous is because as soon as you step in front of a bunch of people and perform, nerves start to come into play. You start to have these feelings of self-consciousness. All of this can interrupt and interfere with your muscle memory, meaning that you can suddenly find yourself totally stuck because you were relying on your muscles remembering which note to play next and with which finger, and you don't have a backup. Okay? This is why Rachmaninoff said, you never truly know a piece of piano music until you can play the left-hand part with your right hand and the right-hand part with your left hand. Because you can't do that unless you have a very deep knowledge and analysis of the piece of music that you're playing. Okay, this stuff is all linked. Now, in language learning, there are lots of ways to do this. You can use mnemonics, which is something that I'm sure all of you guys are familiar with. It's basic word association, image association. You can take new vocabulary and you can relate it to things from your life. So, memories that you've got, people that you know, places you've been. You can take a new word and you can try to relate the sound of the word to something that you already know. Something I often do, which I don't hear many people talking about, but I often use the spelling or letter order of a word, a little hook. Whatever these things are, these are all ways that...
How do you do that?
Sorry?
How do you use the spelling of a letter word?
How do I use the spelling of a letter word? Okay, so what I would do, for example, is, let me think of an example of something that I've learned recently. Need a memory hook, yeah. Well, exactly, I didn't prepare an example for this. But so give me a word, any word. Cow. All right, so what I might do is let's say that there was another word in English that wasn't cow, but it was actually the reverse of that. It was woc, W-O-C. Right? So what I might do in an effort to remember cow, is I might remember that in this word, it's in alphabetical order. So first it's C, and then it's W. And with other words, I remember it, I might say to myself, okay, this word is in reverse alphabetical order, so it's W and then C. Little things like that. If I had a better example off the top of my head, it would maybe make more sense. But the point is that you can look at a word and you can see certain orders of letters or the sounds, whatever it may be, that can give you this second layer of insurance. And this is highly personal. So what I do when I set out learning new words is I would sit down and I'll take a word through this process and I'll try to do all of these things. And a lot of this might not work, but I've got lots of examples of vocabulary that, for example, the way that I remember it is I will remember the place that I was and the person that taught me that word. And for some reason, when I think of that, it comes back. And you never know what this is going to be. We often use the craziest things to remember vocabulary. But the point is that what Bush had not done is sat down with that expression and said, right, how am I going to give myself that safety net? How am I going to remember what that is? And if he'd done one of these things, he would have had that safety net and he would have avoided the situation that happens. We can, if you like, maybe we can come back and talk about this in more detail later. Now, a lot of the time, when you say things like, well, take vocabulary and think about what it means to you in your life, relate it to your memories, there's a danger here that this all sounds very woo-woo and intangible and non-specific, right? But it's not. Now, cognitive scientists know this because there is something called dual coding theory. Anyone heard of this? Dual coding theory is something from cognitive science. I believe I've got a little slide here, maybe. Yeah, how about that? Dual coding is when you approach a piece of information from two sides, verbal association and visual imagery. This is your classic mnemonic. So you will take a word, you'll think about how it sounds, and then you'll try to come up with an image for it in some way. And the reason this works is because the brain processes sound and images through different neural pathways. Okay? So because of that, all of your attempts to remember this word does not live in the same part of your brain. You are actually putting things to do with this word, images, sounds, whatever, in different parts of your brain. And this is your safety net. This is what's known as dual coding. And what we know about memory, the way that memories are formed, memories of anything, memories of words, memories of experiences, memories happen when neurons in different parts of your brain join together and form and link up. So when there are different things going on in different parts of your brain and they link up, that is when memories are formed. And so this is why it's so important to approach learning vocabulary from lots of different angles, as many different angles as possible. It's for this exact reason that just using flashcards over and over again doesn't work, because you're just hammering it from one particular stimulus. So, you need to approach vocabulary as holistically as possible, which means all this typical stuff. It's the reading, it's the writing, it's the listening, but it's also the process of deliberately taking that thing that you want to learn and applying it to as many different situations, concepts and ideas as you can. Now the problem with talking about memory in this way, and you might be thinking this right now, is that people think this is too hard and it takes too long. And there are many different ways to approach doing this, but here's what matters in this whole process. It is the act of doing this stuff. It is the fact that you go through this process of looking for all these associations. It's the act of sitting down every morning at 6:30, which is what I do, and actually with my coffee in a dark room with the sun coming up, actually thinking about these different associations. It's that hard work that makes the word stick. I can give you an image, but it probably won't work for you. It's the fact that it's the effort that you're going to and all the thinking that is what makes the vocabulary stick. So I still catch myself all the time, and it always happens. I'll hear a new word that I really like, and I really want to remember, and I'll just say to myself, great, I've got this cool new word, I'll remember that. And then I have to stop myself straight away and say, no, it doesn't work like that for me. I wish it did, but it doesn't. When I hear new vocabulary and I want to remember it, I have to first of all capture it. So I have to write it down. If I don't do that, it's lost, because you're going to have to come back to that word again, more than once. So if you don't write it down, then it's impossible for you to set out to deliberately remember that word. So I have to write it down. Personally, I actually use flashcard software to write vocabulary down, not because I want to use the flashcards, but actually it's a handy way to keep all of the new vocabulary stored and organized in one place, and of course it's searchable. So I prefer that to notebooks because it's just far more convenient, and it's always on here, so I don't have to worry about leaving my notebook at home. So I capture it, I write it down, and then I take it through the attention process that I described earlier, looking at the vocabulary from lots and lots of different angles. And so this is the attention process, and it's the first part of the A.R.T technique. So, what happens next? Well, as you know, when you first learn a new word, it's very unlikely that you will learn or remember that word first time, right? It doesn't tend to happen. Having tackled a new word and taken it through this attention process, relating it to all the different parts of your life and your memories and your awareness that you can, you're going to have to come back to this new vocabulary many, many times in order to make it stick. Now, sometimes vocabulary does stick first time, and it's great when that happens. Every now and again, I have this totally random experience where someone tells me a new word, I'll repeat it, and it just sticks. It happens, right, from time to time. The problem is that you just can't rely on that happening, or at least I don't want to rely on that happening because I want to try and influence the process and speed it up. So that's why, having spent the time with the vocabulary, looking at it from all these different angles, The next thing you have to plan for is repetition of some kind. Now, repetition can happen very, very naturally over time. If you read enough, if you just learned a new word, let's say you found a new piece of vocabulary in something that you're reading or listening to, if you just say to yourself, right, I'm just going to keep reading and listening every day, eventually that word will crop up again and you'll have an opportunity to revisit that word and hopefully it will strengthen in your mind. But for me, the problem with that is it's leaving it far too much to chance, and I like the process to be more deliberate. And so if I have the intention to learn a word, if I've got a new piece of vocabulary and I'm saying to myself, right, I have the intention of learning this word, I've got that intention, then I need to act accordingly, and I have to plan for this repetition to happen, because I'm not willing to leave it to chance that this word will just stick in my mind. Because as I was explaining earlier with the Asian languages, it's just happened too many times for me to think that that's going to happen. There's a 99% chance that that word is gone if I don't do something deliberate to try to influence the learning process. So, how do I plan for this repetition? There's lots of different ways of doing it. Reading. If you learn a new word from a dialogue of some kind, you can come back to that dialogue every day. What I often do, I often work with a dialogue and I'll come back to it 15, 20, 30, 50 times. Listening to it on the tube on the way into town in London, reading through the transcript. If you repeat your vocabulary enough times by repeat reading, then that's ideal. There's other ways of doing it. People like flashcards. I happen to really like flashcards as well. You can practice using new vocabulary deliberately with a tutor or a teacher or whoever it is that you practice languages with. The emphasis here being on the word deliberate. And one of the things I'll often do in my sessions with my tutor is I'll say, look, I've got a list of vocabulary that I'm trying to hammer in. Can we use this during our lesson? Can you help me actually use this and practice it today? Because the more that you deliberately use it, the more likelihood is that it's going to stick. Writing is something that people don't talk about that much, but writing is a hugely powerful way of learning vocabulary, because you're in control and you're going through the process of actually taking something and then deliberately producing it in an environment that is not high pressure like speaking. You can take your time with it. You can play with it. You can be creative. There's also self-talk. If you happen to see me walking down the street in London, there's a strong likelihood that I'm talking to myself in one language or another, because it's just I quite enjoy it. Experimenting with new words, just trying to recall them, and I'll often take that opportunity as well to take a word I'm trying to learn. I'll say something to myself in a language that I'm learning, or I'll maybe rehearse something that I know I'm likely to say later on that day, and I'll try taking that phrase, and I'll try then saying it in all the other languages I know, just for a laugh, because that's what I'm like. So lots of different ways that you can plan for repetition, but the point is that for me, if I don't plan for that repetition to occur, I am essentially sending this new vocabulary to the wind. So I know that if I don't systematically repeat it, it will not become part of my active vocabulary anytime soon. I'm trying to get predictable results, and that's what I was talking about earlier. And so when it comes to repetition, and this is a key point, and I think that's something that people often miss, especially people that are fond of flashcards. This repetition, whether you are coming back to a word in reading, whether you're using it in flashcards, whether you are doing writing, whatever it may be, for me, the purpose of repetition is to reinforce the associations and the hooks that you've already come up with for that word. Okay? Does that make sense? You remember for the first part, in the attention process, you're coming up with ways to make sense of a new piece of word. You're relating it to different parts of your life and your lived experience and all of that. repetition is what people do naturally. Well, I remember being in Japan on the train on the way to work on the Seibu Ikebukuro-sen, and I'd see these high school kids learning English, and they'd have flashcards, and they were literally going like this, like over and over and over and over and over, trying to hammer it into their brain. What they're doing is repetition, and repetition all the way. You give them an A star for repetition. The problem is they haven't been through the first part of the process, which is to pay attention to that vocabulary and look for ways to make sense of it. So when I'm repeating vocabulary, when I'm taking vocabulary through this deliberate process of repetition, what I'm doing is not just repeating it for the sake of it. Every time I want to use a word or repeat it, I'm going back and I'm trying to reinforce the associations that I've already made, whether that's a mnemonic, whether we've done that fancy trick with the letter order that I was talking about earlier. Whatever hook I've used personally to make sense of that vocabulary, every time I repeat that word, I am bringing that back and trying to reinforce that association. Because when it comes time to speak with somebody, when you want to use that vocabulary in speaking, the only way that you can reliably access that word, recall that word, and use it in speaking is if you've got the association that allows you to recall that word. That's what makes it reliable. Now again, it sounds very onerous, but what happens is once you've been through this process a few times, these associations and mnemonics, whatever, they just fall away because you just begin to know the word. I find that with new vocabulary, once I've taken it through this deliberate process of creating the associations, rehearsing that enough times in my mind, and then speaking, using that vocabulary in speaking with a tutor or a partner, by that point, I tend to know the word, and it just becomes, I guess you'd say it's been acquired, and I no longer need any of the tricks. I just know it. It's a new piece of vocabulary that I know. But I've got to that point by going through this process. Now, all of this stuff I would consider to be the preparation. It's creating the means by which your brain can recall new vocabulary on demand such that you can use it in speaking without the fear of not being able to access the word when you need it. I find that this is usually not enough. With Cantonese, which is what I'm learning at the moment, it happens to me all the time that I learn a new word. I practice it till the cows come home. I feel like I know it. And then I'm out talking with a friend and I'll use that word and he or she will turn around and say, no, you can't say that. Oh, no, that's not right. Right? It happens all the time. I find it happens more with languages that are distant from English because you just got less of an understanding of that word. But this is good, and I actually like it when that happens. You have to be able to laugh at yourself and take the joke, which with Cantonese people is sometimes a bit tricky because they're extremely direct in their criticism and their willingness to just burst out laughing at something that you say. But I find that you only ever start to truly know a word once you use it in conversation. Because once you've used a word enough times and you have effectively negotiated for meaning and you're not met with a huge laugh or something, so you have reduced any uncertainty over how that word is used and what it means, then you kind of get to the point where you can confidently use it. And so that's why, for me, the third part of the process, I really did try to look hard for a noun that would make this art thing complete and, make me feel very academic. But I just called it try it out. Because you've got to do it. You have to try it out and use it in conversation. You can do it. You can take the slower route. You can wait until the need. You could easily argue and legitimately argue, well, if you never need to naturally use a word in conversation, then, well, you probably don't need to know that word in the first place. Again, for me, this is all about predictable results and a systematic approach to this process of growing vocabulary. And so the last part of this process for me is to deliberately start to try out this new vocabulary in conversation, because that's when you only truly know a word. So once I can reliably recall a word in conversation through the associations that I've created and the process of repetition that I've been through to reinforce those associations, which means it doesn't take me half an hour to get it back, and it's kind of fairly snappy. And I've also used it in conversation to the extent that I'm confident that I'm using this word correctly. That's the point at which I feel like I really know this word. It's become part of my active vocabulary, whatever that means. And then all of the work that I've done to that point simply falls away, and I just know the word. At this stage, when you are at the point of needing to practice vocabulary, this is where I find a really good teacher is priceless. Because a really good teacher, and they don't have to be professional, often language exchange partners can be just as good at this, but someone who can patiently help you practice vocabulary, who can get what you're trying to do, and doesn't think that it's stupid if you're deliberately dropping the word chicken into every other sentence because you're trying to remember it. You know, someone who can play along and be that sympathetic listener is super important. Someone that you work with on a regular basis. In my Cantonese lessons, I try to have 2 or 3 sessions a week with the same person, because what I find is that teacher becomes familiar with your emerging vocabulary, and they can help you then scaffold it even more, and which is all part of the process. And then at that point, you also start to be able to use that new vocabulary in casual conversation, which is the best of all. And for me, this is the most fun part of the whole process, and for me, it's what it's all about, because for me, all I really want to do is to be able to sit down with someone with a coffee and chat and have fun. That's all I care about. And so this is how I do it. So to recap what I've talked about, I've attempted to describe the way that I have been thinking about the process of acquiring and growing my vocabulary over the last year or so, off the back of some pretty difficult experiences trying to learn Asian languages. I've broken it down into 3 parts. We've talked about the attention process, where you're spending time, quiet time, deliberate time, looking at the vocabulary, trying to create associations and give it meaning in your mind, so that you've got that dual coding we talked about, that safety net, so that if you forget the word, you've got a way to get back to it and retrieve it. Then we talked about the repetition process, where you need to come back to that word more than once, plenty of times, and at each point, you're not just hammering your flashcards over and over. The purpose of the repetition is to try to recall and strengthen that association that you've created. And then finally, you're trying it out so that you're using that vocabulary in conversation, and then you really start to own it. Now, you might think that all of this is crazy, and I can think of at least one person in this room that I know for a fact thinks that. In your language learning efforts, you might do something totally different. And as I said at the beginning, when I started learning languages, and I know my French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, I didn't use any of this stuff. I just talked to people, and that was enough. So, you've got to take it for what it is, and I would not suggest that that anyone takes this and follows this process step by step. But if you are struggling with memory, if you are attempting to make sense of your memory, and you would like to be able to influence the process, then I would suggest that you have a look at these 3 parts that I've described, and think about which of these 3 parts are you maybe not spending as much time on. And I would suggest that if you start to deliberately spend more time on those parts, on that part that you are maybe not paying as much attention to, that may have a pleasant outcome for you in your efforts to grow your vocabulary. So that's what I got. Before we have a discussion, I'd like to just point out for any of you who don't know me, I have a podcast in which I talk about this stuff endlessly and bore you to death. 2 episodes a week that come out on the podcast. I mostly answer questions from people, so people kind of call in and leave questions, and I give my best answer. So check that out. It's called the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. You can find it on iTunes, Stitcher, anywhere else. Anyone here listen to the podcast? Hey, that's great. Please leave a review and rating on the podcast because it helps. It really does help. Although good luck with the Wi-Fi in this building doing that. I also have a blog where I release a bunch of stuff. And if you would like to grow your vocabulary more, then a very good way to do that is by reading. And I produced a series of readers at different levels in different languages, which people seem to like. And feel free to pick up a copy of those. I don't have any here, but you can find them on Amazon. The audiobook and the print book and the Kindle book as well is all available. So yeah, I'd love you to try that out. Also, very last thing, I am looking for experienced teachers of German, French, Japanese, and Italian. If that is you and you fancy working with me, please come and have a chat later and we can talk more. So thank you very much, and I'd like to use as much time as possible to discuss what I've talked about.
This is actually the second session in a row where the presenter has thrown a job opportunity out there, so this could be life-changing for lots of people. I'll start with questions over here.
It's not a question, I'm just going to reinforce something. Yes, Ruski здесь? Not one? Okay. If I were to point at Ollie and say, "Un голубой," what would you understand?
He's gay?
Yeah, but what's the other word for голубой? Like blue. I'm walking in Leningrad and I say to my friend, some guy walks by, this is referring to triad, some guy walks by with a shirt like that, and I'm practicing my Russian, I go, un голубой. And everyone stops, he looks at me angry, I'm like, what? God, what is the problema? And everyone goes, you just called him a fag. It's not just nice gay, but so you have to try it out. And the other thing is, I've been speaking Russian 25 years and I cannot remember the difference between холодно and тепло. And that's why I asked you why you play with the letters.
Yeah.
As soon as you did that, I checked. Холодно is cold. I had to look at it again. And all I did was hold, cold. So now, all of a sudden, for the first time in 25 years, холодно, cold. Тепло, tea. Oh, tea is hot. Тепло. All because you said that now. So next time when someone asks you about transposing letters, forget about cow. Russian. Холодно, cold. Cold,
Good. I hope someone got that on camera.
I saw the hand over here. Maybe? Yes, over here.
Well, you clearly emphasize learning a language as basically a memory exercise. Do you, in your experience, feel that some people have more memory than others, which makes them more prone to learn languages quickly? Or does everybody have the same memory capacity?
I'm not in any way qualified to answer that question, but my issue with those with statements like that is, well, what's the consequence of going down that route? I mean, if it's the case that some people have a worse memory than others, what does that mean? You don't try? Do you not? What do you do with that? I mean, I have a pretty bad memory as in terms of a self-diagnosis of my memory is that I don't think I've got a good memory at all. But all I can really say to that is that from my own experiments with this and from people who have been through the courses that I produced, the course that I produced on this specific art technique, it can be influenced at every step of the way. So I don't think I'm able to answer the question other than to say that it's completely open to influence, and your memory, I think, can be improved through specific steps. But I think it does take a deliberate effort to try to understand, I think, these different elements of what it means to acquire vocabulary and what it means to sit down and explore a word for 5 minutes in a quiet room, or to deliberately bring that word back. All these different parts of the process, I think, often when people say, I've got a bad memory, it's just they haven't actually sat down and really spent time thinking about how to apply these things and what are the different parts of the process that can affect the outcome. So that's my best answer, I'm afraid. Might not be very satisfactory. Would anyone else like to comment on that? Someone more learned than me?
I've got just a question here, and I can come. You want to continue to speak? I'll come around to you on it.
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to share something, if that's okay.
Sure.
So you said that you really struggled with learning vocabulary in Asian languages just because they're so different from anything else you knew. And I just wanted to share my own way of dealing with that. This is just my own style, so of course it may or may not work for other people. But I found there was a certain point in the learning process where you've become familiar enough with the language and the way it sounds and the general way words are put together that when you learn new words, you remember them more easily.
Yeah.
And I think that comes, around the intermediate level.
Yeah.
And so my way of dealing with that is to basically inundate myself with as much content as possible in the beginning stages and to try to get through those beginning stages really quickly. So I learned very intensively in the beginning stages. And then once I've reached that intermediate level, then I can kind of slow down a little bit more. And when I learn new words, they stick more easily than before. And so I don't really use flashcards or mnemonic techniques or things like that, because I find if I go through the beginning stage really quickly, then once I reach the intermediate stage, I can just kind of enjoy, reading and using the language more, and I learn new words more naturally. So that's just my style.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think my reaction to that is that the kind of caveat to all of this is exactly what you said. The reason that I've experienced vocabulary being so hard to grow in an unfamiliar language is because you just don't have this existing schemata, you don't have this existing enough hooks to hold on to. But as soon as you get to that level that you described, I mean, I'd agree that somewhere in between B1 and B2, you have enough of a knowledge of the language that that you can start to relate new words to things that you already know in that language, and there's a big snowball effect, absolutely. I think that's related to what I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, though, which is that as much of a lot of this this stuff that I do is aimed at new learners who are getting to grips with this for the first time. It is very much the beginning stages that people struggle with, and this perceived problem of I've got a bad memory. And if they had the experience that many people in this room have of, like you say, getting through the beginner stages quickly, if they knew how to do it, then everything gets a lot easier. But I think that the perceived difficulty for many people at the beginning is so great as to be as for me, as to sort of necessitate this way of looking at the problems. Yeah.
Well, just to follow on, I totally agree with both positions, and that is once you're an experienced language learner, the fact that in the early stages everything slips through your fingers and you can't remember anything and you forget everything you learn, from experience that's a stage you have to go through. So I don't invest any time in trying to hook into any word. I know that eventually they'll start to slot in. And when I work very hard to learn now, I may forget for 6 months and it shows up later. But I agree with you, a lot of people get discouraged, and therefore techniques like this, which give them a sense of achievement, some footing, probably can be quite effective. But I don't rely on memory at all. I rely entirely on exposure.
I've got a comment here.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to comment as an English teacher for several years. This is definitely the number one complaint that I get from my adult students. Have bad memory, I can't remember what's going on. I would just add to your point that there are several processes of memory as well. There's the short-term memory, there's recall as well. So within your lexicon, how much are you actually activating So many students will say, I know the words, I understand the words, but I'm not using them. So I think the more you can explicitly call out these different processes and become aware of, well, what is it that you're struggling with? And also acknowledging the realities of being an adult learner and saying, well, there are just many more things that are taxing your memory. It's not necessarily a question of being worse, but there are far greater demands on your attention and memory as you're juggling a job and a family and responsibilities than when you're, for example, a student or a traveler. So I think the more you can acknowledge these obstacles and prepare for them and strategize and experiment with techniques that do help, it does kind of get over some of those humps.
Yeah, and my challenge to every teacher in the room is to try to, from time to time, step away from the student's expectation that, right, today I'm going to teach you 10 new words, and actually talk about this stuff and ask them, well, okay, you're finding it difficult to remember vocabulary. Let's talk about why that happens. Let's spend time on this. If as you say, this is one of the great problems experienced by learners, it always astounds me how there is such little attention paid to this procedural stuff in language classrooms and teaching in general. It's just all a kind of free-for-all. Teach more, teach faster. So if any of you teachers watching, I'd really encourage you to deal with these issues head-on with your students and to get them to raise that awareness of what's going on and not to try and avoid this kind of sort of flippant attitudes of, well, I've got a bad memory, poor me.
So, question about the first part of your technique, the attention part.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the attention part is focused on creating these hooks for new vocabulary. And these hooks can take different forms, presumably, right? They can be sort of other words in the same language. They can be words in your own language or in other languages,
sure.
Or they can be images or something textual. Do you find that, in particular for the first two, so, hooks that are, let's say, words in the same language or, words in different language, do you find there's a difference between the, like, is sort of one a stronger hook than another, or are they all the same, or is it just a personal?
The only thing I can reliably say is that I often have to go through a wide range of approaches to finding those associations in order to find the one that will work for that particular word. Sometimes I'll try to relate that word to a similar sounding word in that language. The advantage of being knowing a number of languages is that your available hooks increase, so that often I'll find that I'll learning a new word in Cantonese, for example, and I'll relate it to a Spanish word that I know. Your resources to draw on become larger. I often find more often than not, I'll have something like this. So I'll take a word like this, ginti, which means to persist or to be kind of a sense of persistence. It doesn't translate very well into English. And this is a word that I struggled for a long time to remember, for whatever reason. For people that know Chinese and know reading and writing, they can look at this and, again, break it down and have the approach of knowing what the characters mean. But for me, when I tried to learn this word, I couldn't rely on the writing, so I had to take a purely auditory approach to it. And the way that I ended up remembering this word is just to say it over and over again. Ginti, ginti. What does this sound like? And over 100 times, and eventually I kind of went ginti, ginti, green tea. That's what worked for me. Now, when I drink green tea, I go crazy. It wires me up. Like, if I have 1 cup of green tea, it will have the effect of 10 espressos on me. But luckily, that actually ties in very nicely to the meaning of the word that I'm trying to remember, which is to persist. And so I picture myself sitting at it. I remember a time when I was living in Qatar, sitting at my desk, had a cup of green tea, and I did the best night's work I ever did, because I was so wired from the green tea that it was some serious persistence. Right? So that's an example of the kind of route that I would take to remember a word like this, but I've never forgotten it since. Now, I'm not suggesting you do the same thing, but the point is that that's what I did for this word. For another word, it might just be, like we were saying earlier, there happens to be a particular letter order, alphabetical or reverse alphabetical, which helps to stick it in my mind. So the only thing I can reliably say is that whether it's finding mnemonics in the same language, in a different language, looking at the spelling, looking at whatever it may be, I expect that I'll have to take it through a whole variety of approaches until I find the one that's going to work.
Hi, I just wanted to make 2 comments as a teacher, and of course, the new things that will really help for people who struggle with vocabulary, especially different ones. And also taking advantage that you showed that your book's on short stories. So I wanted to mention that I happened to buy short stories for beginners, and I really enjoy how you deal with it, right? Like for those who have not heard of it, so I wanted to mention that I highly recommend it, right? So basically, you have the vocabulary, summary, reviews, you explain at the beginning why you do it this way, so very helpful.
Oh, that's great to hear. I mean, the short story books are based on something called Comprehensible Input. Not sure what that is, but...
That's all the time we have for questions, everyone. Let's give a very...